Good morning. Hi, my name is Alfred Wong. I'm the secretary of the Pan-Asia Alumni Association. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Pan-Asia Alumni Association and the planning committee for this year's conference, I would like to thank you, all of you, for joining us today. As many of you know, this is our third annual conference. The first one was 2 years ago in Taipei, and the second one was last year in Shanghai. And we hope that this year in Hong Kong will make it as successful a conference as it was 2 years ago. This year we have we are very honored that a lot of distinguished alumni and guests from NYU have agreed to speak to us, and distinguished guests like Dr. Fong. We hope that you will have an enjoyable day, learn a lot from this year's speakers. And so with that, I would like to invite Mr. Andre Ku, our Stern graduate of 97, president of the NYU, 94. I forgot, we were the same year. I'll try to make both of us look younger. Yeah. And so he's a president of the NYU Pan-Asia Association and a NYU trustee and member of the Stern Board of Overseers. Andre?
Thank you, Alfred. Good morning, everyone. In my capacity as president of the NYU Pan-Asia Alumni Association, I'm pleased to welcome you to the third annual Pan-Asia Alumni Conference. For those of you attending the conference for the first time, the Pan-Asia Alumni Association was created in 2013. When several regional alumni club leaders got together with the intent of establishing a platform to facilitate networking and promote support of NYU among the more than 14,000 alumni living and working in Asia. I encourage you to get actively involved and support your local alumni clubs and Pan-Asia Alumni Association and the broader NYU community so we can expand the alumni network and advance the NYU brand. I am proud to be sponsor of the conference through Yellowstone Holding, and I am delighted to thank our sponsors for their support. They include Alex and Wright, which is represented by Ming and her husband, Nate, Flora Huang, and Daniel Xu, Cartwell Capital, T Pages Mall, the NYU Alumni Club of South China, and the NYU Alumni Club of Hong Kong. I wanted to acknowledge the committee member of the Pan-Asia Alumni Association for their hard work in organizing this event. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce NYU 16th President Andrew Hamilton. For those of you who were not with us at the alumni reception last night, allow me to share some of Andy's extraordinary credentials. Andy came to NYU from Oxford University, where he served as Vice Chancellor for 6 years. He is also the former Provost of Yale, and prior to that was on the faculty of the University of Pittsburgh and Princeton. Andy is a noted chemist, and he maintains an active program of training and research at NYU. He has demonstrated a strong commitment to academic excellence and teaching and faculty support. He was inaugurated as the 16th president in September, as we are all very happy to have him here with us in Hong Kong today. Please join me in welcoming President Andrew Hamilton.
Andre, thank you very much for that warm welcome and introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure for me to be one of those very first attendees, well, first year attendees at this Pan-Asia Conference. As Andre has said, I became the 16th president of NYU in January. And so to have an opportunity in my first year to come to Hong Kong, this most exciting city, this most dynamic city, this sister city of New York, to come and be part of this special Pan-Asia Conference is an enormous pleasure. And let me also express my thanks to all of the organizers of the Pan-Asia Symposium, and very especially to express my thanks to Andre Koo for all of the incredible hard work and effort that he puts in to this program and to the Pan-Asia Alumni Society. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you participants in this symposium and to thank all of the speakers. I'd especially like to thank our first speaker this morning, Victor Fung, who is an old friend from my time at Oxford. It's great to see you again, Victor. Let me also just point out a couple of other people in the audience. Attending today, we have Jonathan Kim, who is one of NYU's trustees. So it's wonderful to see Jonathan in Hong Kong. And let me also point out two of NYU's academic leadership who are with us today. Peter Henry, the Dean of the Stern School of Business, who we will be hearing from later, and also Professor Jeffrey Lehman. And Jeff is the Vice Chancellor of NYU Shanghai, and Jeff will also be talking about the role of education in this changing world later this afternoon. The theme for today's conference is thriving in a changing world. And boy, as we sit here in November 2016, we are observing, we are encountering a world that is perhaps presenting some of the most challenging environments, some of the most challenging uncertainties that we've seen for a very long time. We are 4 days away from a presidential election in the United States that could change everything. You can hear from my accent, ladies and gentlemen, that I come from a country, the United Kingdom, that is also undergoing huge changes and perhaps massive uncertainty around its relationship with the European Union at the present time. So in this changing world, how do we think about positioning ourselves in the world of business, in the world of education, in the world of policy, in order to thrive? And that will be the topic today, and it'll be wonderful and exciting to listen to our speakers. I represent, of course, NYU. And NYU, in many respects, is a wonderful example of an institution that has thrived and that has changed itself in order to respond to the very changing times that it passes through. NYU, as all of you know, was founded in 1831. And what was happening at that time in 1831? The cutting-edge technology of the time was changing the world. In 1831, the cutting-edge technology was canal building. Hard to think now that that was changing the world, but of course trade and business was transformed by the building of canals like the Erie Canal. And in the early 19th century, the Erie Canal turned New York City into the most important city in the United States, and it remains the most important city in the United States, despite what they say in San Francisco or in Boston, and especially Washington, D.C. New York is the most important city. And think of New York as it changed during the past century and a half. New York went down, as cities sometimes do, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. NYU took that timing and the necessity of change. It consolidated. It sold its campus in the Bronx, as many of you know, the Washington Heights campus. It consolidated in Manhattan. The timing was perfect. NYU then was able to benefit from the Manhattan bounce that occurred in the 80s and the 90s, and NYU is thriving as a result of that, responding to the times in the changing world. And even more recently, we've seen NYU, as the economy has become more global, it is NYU with impeccable timing that has opened a campus in Shanghai. Vice Chancellor Lehman is the head of that campus. It has also opened a campus in Abu Dhabi, just as those two areas of the world, Shanghai and China, Abu Dhabi and the Gulf, as they have become critically important players on the world stage. And so from the perspective of education, NYU is a university that constantly seeks to reinvent itself, to reflect the changing times, and to thrive in those changing times. And so it's very right, very proper that our focus today should be thriving in a changing world. NYU is thriving. It's thriving because of that adaptability. It's thriving because of its wonderful alumni, many of whom are here today, and we are delighted to be part of a symposium that focuses on the issues of the most importance to the world. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this exciting symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Today, we have an exciting lineup of speakers and panelists who will be addressing the theme of thriving in a changing world. To kick things off, we have Dr. Victor Fong, chairman of the Fung Group, as the keynote speaker. Dr. Fong holds bachelor and master's degree in electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a doctorate in business economics from Harvard University. He taught at the Harvard Business School before returning to his family business of Li & Fung, which under his leadership has become a top consumer goods design, development, sourcing, logistics, and distribution company for major retailers and brands around the world. In addition to running his family business, Dr. Fong has also served in many professional and civic appointments at organizations such as Hong Kong Government's Economic Development Commissions, Hong Kong Trade Development Council, Airport Authority of Hong Kong, International Chamber of Commerce, the G20 Advisory Group, China Sinopec, Chow Tai Fook Jewelry Group, and many more. In July 2015, Dr. Fong became chairman of the advisory board of the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong, a think tank dedicated to generating research on global issues from Asia perspectives. With such an impressive background in Hong Kong, China, and internationally, I can't think of a more appropriate person than Dr. Fong to speak on the topic of Hong Kong's future in a changing environment. Even though this year Hong Kong's GDP shows signs of moderate growth, its import and export contract due to China's slowdown, a travel-related sector have been hit hard as mainland travelers shift to places such as Europe and Japan. With geopolitical risk around the world on the rise and a lackluster global economy, it is a timely occasion to hear Dr. Fong's views and proposals for the way that Hong Kong can remodel itself and maintain its competitiveness. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Fong, I want to remind you that today's conference will end around 5 p.m. For those of you joining us for the gala dinner, a cocktail reception will begin at 7 p.m. in the Joseph Lau and Josephine Lau Roof Garden, sponsored by the NYU Alumni Club in Hong Kong. Dinner will follow at 8 p.m. in this same room, and I look forward to seeing you here. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Fong.
Andy, Andre, alumni of NYU, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great honor for me to be here with you today. And I too like to extend my personal very warm welcome to all of you to Hong Kong. It's really a great honor for us in Hong Kong for you to host your alumni conference in Hong Kong. This is, I think, really the topic that you're exploring, I think, is something that's very close to my heart as well. And what I will try to do is perhaps to give you a view of Hong Kong position against this changing world, and maybe give you some views on how I see the world changing to begin. But I just want to follow on some of the comments that Andre made earlier. I think yes, there are frankly, many economies around the world, including Hong Kong, is under pressure. It's absolutely true. However, by some measures, Hong Kong economy is still not doing badly. As Andre mentioned, our external trade in goods and services continue to grow. And frankly, growth, especially in top line in today's economy, is not a mean feat. Our labor market is resilient. We're still enjoying full employment in Hong Kong. In fact, our tourist numbers are in fact up. The issue there is the yield of the tourists are going down. I think the quality of the tourists, I think we need to be thinking about, and it's had a very big impact on our retailing sector. But that's basically, sort of the situation today. But, we need to remember that Hong Kong has always been built around flows, all the way from the founding of the city back 100, 150 years ago. We're really talking about flows of people, flows of goods, flows of funds, and flows of information. And in this respect, I think Hong Kong continues to be a major hub in the region. I think it goes without saying that Hong Kong still has more multinationals headquartered here for the Asian operation than any other place in the region. And we are absolutely the hub for this particular time zone. It's New York, London, Hong Kong. And this has been repeated and repeated. But before I go into looking a little bit into the future of Hong Kong, let me just step back for a moment and perhaps share with you some of my own views on this changing world. And then I will try and answer the question, how do you thrive in this changing world? I think there are really two mega trends that we should really be thinking about. If I could just take you back to history a little bit. Everybody talks about globalization. And that certainly has been an absolute mega trend, but I'd like to just delve a little deeper into that. where it has been, and where it's going to go. Because I think, in my mind, the whole globalization trend probably started 35 years ago, back into the year of 1980, when China started its economic opening. And at that time, actually, Hong Kong was actually under a lot of pressure because we, believe it or not, was a manufacturing economy back then. And we were exporting basically low-end consumer products. Hong Kong was losing out to the four little dragons of Asia. What really happened was, what frankly saved us at that time was the economic opening of China, and especially Shenzhen, the special economic zone just across the border. What we did was to take Hong Kong's production process. We kept the high value added front end and the back end, meaning the front end being the marketing, the design, the engineering, the back end being the banking and logistics and distribution. And the labor-intensive middle portion went across the border into China. And it was kind of a win-win process. And from there, basically, we evolved the global supply chains. And Hong Kong became a major orchestrator of global supply chains. But then if you follow that whole process for 35 years to today, what we've basically seen is a complete movement of a brand new type of manufacturing I would call radical outsourcing. And everything was completely globalized. And what we really saw was a period of 35 years in which we had a globalization of production. The production process was totally globalized. However, if you step back and look at the consumption, I would submit the consumption was still very concentrated and frankly very localized. Let me tell you what I mean. If you look at global consumption, over the last 35 years, it really been a story of concentration in the West, Europe and America, let's say the OECD countries. In fact, I just looked up the statistics recently, and in fact, back in 1980, an unbelievable 83% of global consumption was in the OECD countries. And kind of the rest of the world consumed 17%. Now, that trend has been changing because we have seen the developing of the developing economies, and especially the growth of a middle class in those developing economies. And that measure today is about still 70% in OECD. So what you saw, really, if you think back to the last 35 years of globalization, it was a globalization, really, of production, whereas the consumption was still concentrated in the West and very localized. That was really the picture. In fact, if I look back at what we were doing as Li and Fung and orchestrator of global supply chains, and we were very much a part of this wave, we basically sourced in the East, if you would, and sold in the West. Sourced in the East, sold in the West. And the supply chains were really relatively simple. It went one way. And for those of us who've been around for a little while, remember those days when all the containers ended up in the West and it had to come back empty. It was just sort of like, it was a question of efficiency and not effectiveness. And every time a piece of product moves through, you try to shave a fraction of a cent of that product. Now, we thought it was rather complex at the time. We were doing radical outsourcing. We had 15,000 suppliers in 60 countries, putting things together, using dramatically the internet, etc. But really, that is what it really is. Now, if you take a breather and look forward 35 years to the middle of this century, I think you'll see a dramatic change, this time now in the consumption. If the growth in the middle class continues, and I don't want to belabor you with numbers, in Asia alone, over the next 35 years, we expect an influx of about 3.5 billion middle-class consumers. Now, I'm not suggesting that the West consumption will decline, but it will grow, but slowly. The growth of consumption will be in the developing economies, especially in Asia. And we would expect by the middle of the century that the consumption in the developing economies will exceed the consumption in the West, in the OECD countries, if you would. And the world would have flipped. So what we're really seeing now is, yes, the globalizing of production will continue, although there's some arguments. I'm happy to answer questions if you like. You know, there's some arguments about flow back and reshoring. You know, we can debate all that. I'm not so sure that trend is that strong, to be honest. But then what we really see superimposed on top of that is a globalization of consumption. Now, what are the consequences for an international business? If you're trying to sell, as I said in the past, to a global market, in the past period, it was relatively simple. You source in the East. I remember as recently as 5 years ago, Time magazine front cover, China, factory for the world. Remember that picture? Okay, now we still produce 1 million widgets in China, but you're not going to ship everything to Europe and America. Yeah, you probably ship half of it to America and Europe, but half of it you want to distribute in China, in ASEAN, in India, etc. So your supply chains are really becoming a lot more nuanced. It's not as one way, you know, sort of, you're going to be actually now thinking through a much more nuanced. In fact, we're beginning to source a lot more from Europe. Because why? Because made in France is a premium in China as a cachet. So you're going to, the flows are completely different. And the supply chains are a lot more complex. And also, you're going to now start asking the question, this new consumption. In fact, us economists keeps asking, you know, the world is suffering from lack of aggregate demand, right? This question repeats in the press every day. Yeah, but I don't know how much can you really whip out of the existing horse of the West, the economies in the West. How much more demand can you really squeeze out of that? If you want to create new demand in the world, if you want to create new aggregate demand, you've got to develop new markets, and that's the growing markets, you know, in the developing economies, and especially in Asia. That's really what we're really talking about. But then you've got to start asking the question, okay, these new markets, frankly, what do they want to buy? You know, is it the same stuff? You know, I remember a very famous Harvard Business School professor, Ted Levitt, wrote an article in 1993. It was globalization. He was really thinking the whole world will buy Colgate toothpaste. And it will be manufactured completely in America and shipped globally. I don't think that's the picture. That's not the world that we see now developing. So more importantly, how are you going to distribute to this new market? Those are the real issues that I think for a global marketer today. You know, it's not, if you look at really the infrastructure of the markets, not infrastructure, the structure of the markets. You know, Li and Fung, we tell the world we have 7,000 customers, retailers and brands large and small around the world. But if you really dig deep, 400 account for most of the volume. And if you have 400 major customers in terms of brands and retailers in Europe and America, you've covered substantially the entire market. The market is actually well developed and structured. And a small number of very well entrenched large entities, basically, you've got the whole market. However, if you look at this new consumption, what you're really saying, yes, in aggregate, it's huge, but it's among billions of people. And you got literally accessing these markets, you got to think about really going through hundreds, you know, well, maybe hundreds of thousands, but certainly maybe even more, millions of small and medium-sized wholesalers, retailers, etc. You know, in the new jargon, it's not a B2B problem, it's a B to small b problem. And you know, I used to go crazy thinking about how you collect from even 100,000 wholesalers around Asia. We bought a business, it was a British trading company called Inchcape, and we had 100,000 accounts. And it was, gee, how do you collect these from these guys? Now, I think the collection problem has been somewhat solved by technology today. You know, the PayPals, the Alipays, 10Pays, et cetera. But how about the distribution problem? I think it's still to be worked on. I won't go there, but I think what we're really seeing is really developing a B to small b solution. The idea of really forward positioning your goods into depots to serve very small, localized, intense localized markets, each of which I think will be totally Uberized. So it's really a deployment. Then you ask yourself, is 5,000 depots enough for China? 10,000? I can't answer that question. It's a question of optimization. But then you've got to really think through that whole scheme. But anyway, the point I want to make is that is the world that we're facing. And that, I think, for in global business and for a place like Hong Kong that serves this global market, you know, what is our role in this changing world? Now, so that's one major trend. The second major trend I like to just point to very quickly is really what's called the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road, the 21st Century Silk Road Initiative from China. Now, I think many of you are very, very familiar with it in the audience, I'm sure. For those who are not, I still quite amazed when I address groups of businessmen, really key businessmen in the United States and Europe. Maybe 80% of them will tell me, yeah, I sort of vaguely saw something like that in the Wall Street Journal a year ago, but what is it? If you're not onto it now, I think you better study it quite thoroughly. Because I think that's going to be one of the major developments. It's China's outreach. It's really the reconnection of the old Silk Roads, both overland, okay, sort of in the north, the Northern Silk Road, and then the development of a new Silk Road concept, which is the Maritime Silk Road, which basically links maritime China all the way through Southeast Asia, through East Asia, all the way to the Middle East and Europe. So really, really, I look at it as a Northern Silk Road and a Southern Silk Road. This silk, sorry, just take a quick drink here. This Belt and Road Initiative, I think, would cover about, today, 60-some countries, about 4 billion people, about a third of the world's GDP, and about a third of the world's consumption. But I think the very interesting thing is, as this develops, I think the Northern Silk Road actually, if you look at it, will be somewhat like an inbound Silk Road to China, basically for energy and commodities moving inward into China. The Southern Silk Road, the Maritime Silk Road, is really an outbound Silk Road from China where some of China's products are developing. But this is not a China-only initiative. It's initiated by China, but I think the implications are vast. The way one could imagine, in my mind, would be think of a humongous shopping center. You've got 2 anchor tenants on each end, and that's China and Europe. And if these anchor tenants develop and benefit themselves, they're going to benefit everybody in between, all the shops in the shopping center. And that's the real concept. And really, on a more global stage, everybody knows that the multilateral agencies, that's, you know, people call the Bretton Woods, that was initiated right after the war 70 years ago, have really, in a sense, are in great need of updating to fit today's world. You've got to ask yourself, are these multilateral institutions still fit for purpose for today's world and today's environment? Everybody says they need to be updated. Nobody wants to make the move. But I think the Belt and Road Initiative, especially with the creation of something called the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is going to introduce a new form of multilateral institution that will begin the whole questioning of the Bretton Woods institutions. And there'll be a wave of renewal, I think, of the multilateral agencies. I hope they will merge, and then we become a global multilateral again. But it could be competing blocks, I don't know. But whatever it is, it'll change. So I think another mega trend in my mind is this Belt and Road Initiative as it unfolds. The real significance I see from a businessman's perspective is, remember that new consumption I just talked about? Those developing economies? How do you access them? It turns out that if you look in detail, the economies along the Belt and Road, especially the Maritime Silk Road in the south, links about 80% of this new consumption. So if you're looking for a platform to access the new consumption, the next wave in the world, the developing economies, the Belt and Road is actually have a potential of becoming that platform. And that's the way I kind of look at that particular initiative. So you've got these two mega trends, the globalization of consumption. And by the way, I didn't even touch on this thing here. You know, this is going to happen much faster and much greater depth because the globalization of consumption because of this. You know, and then the other thing, of course, is that the Belt and Road Initiative. And these mega trends are the things that we, in my mind, would be the backdrop to us trying to answer the question that the conference poses. Now, so what about Hong Kong then in this context, which I've been asked to say a few words about? Okay, I think Hong Kong has traditionally always been, in the last 30 years, a source of inflow of capital, of talent, of multinationals, etc., into China. I think what we're going to be seeing in light of this new world that I'm describing would be increasingly, yes, people will continue to want to invest in China because they want to access this new consumption, remember? And in fact, we will be seeing more imports, inflow of goods into China. So instead of thinking about China as just an export platform to serve the whole world, it's going to be both an export platform, it will continue to be that way, but it will also become a big market for import. So we're going to see a two-way flow of goods and merchandise. And that flow will be very strong. The other thing is, Hong Kong used to account for about 70% of China's foreign direct investments every year, okay, come through Hong Kong. It dropped a little bit. Frankly, it's actually, I looked at numbers, it's come back up to, close to that level today. It's still the main gateway. But what is very important is there's a huge new flow that is the Chinese capital now going to the rest of the world via Hong Kong. Now, we don't have a 70% share of that flow, but it's significant. I think it's slightly less than 50%, but it's still high. So what we're really now seeing is Hong Kong is experiencing not a flow into China for capital and out of China for goods, but in a sense, two-way flow in both goods and investments. So actually, that to me gives a brand new reason for Hong Kong to really get its act together and actually help those importing of goods and exporting of capital, and really working with Chinese enterprises as they go abroad, okay, and be the launching off point for that flow. And in my mind, when you have one-way flow, it's one thing. It's nice to be a flow, and then you help the flow, you expedite. But when there are two-way flows in anything, you create markets. And actually, two-way flow is more than 1 + 1. And you really can then think about a lot of things, and especially when you have two-way flows of goods and services, and investment flows, then you have an interesting mix. And of course, you put that against, everything that we have traditionally, the common law system, the impartiality, and then very importantly, our IP regime is very strong in Hong Kong. And that is something that I think in the innovation and technology area, people would look to. So all those actually is one major new development dimension for the Hong Kong market. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is in the area of innovation. If you look at an economy like China, and look at all the, previous 12, the 5-year plans up to the 12th 5-year plan, it's really been a story of economic growth, but based on what economists would call factor inputs: low-cost labor, low-cost land, more investments, etc. I think that the days that China's doing two things. One is it's looking beyond just growth of the economy in sort of numerical terms. We're talking about the qualitative terms, the green economy, the more equal distribution of income, etc. So there are other factors factor into the growth. But very importantly, I think China has to really start looking at the question of productivity growth. It frankly hasn't been that way, if you think about it. It's always been factor input, just more, cheaper, etc. Now the focus is very much onto productivity growth. And the key to that, of course, is the whole idea of innovation. So what you see in the 13th 5-year plan, which is coming up, is really the almost complete focus on innovation. It's innovation everywhere, in all. And the way I look at innovation is much more than technology. A lot of people equate technology with innovation. I think technology is a form of innovation. It's a catalyst for innovation. But there are a lot of innovations that happen without technology. Maybe technology could be a catalyst for innovation. I'm not undermining the importance of technology. I come from MIT undergraduate, so I'm a technology guy. But I just want to put that in perspective. Now, if you look at that, I think, and what's happening in China, I think Hong Kong could play a real role in two respects. One is Hong Kong is not a dramatic center for creation of new technology, but we actually have thrived over the years in using existing technology to develop new business models that have real impact and that are real innovation. Hong Kong actually is a dramatic innovator of new business models. You take the global supply chains. It would not have happened without the internet. In fact, at any one time, Li and Fung has thousands of orders in bits and pieces in thousands of factories. How do we keep track of that? How do we allocate things back and forth? The other enabler, of course, is modern logistics, getting things from here to there just in time and controlling that. All that is actually technology-based. And the whole global supply chain orchestration that Hong Kong has developed, which is actually a new business model for the world, was dependent on the use of technology. It's not advanced technology. It's available technology at that time, which is the use of the internet, etc. So, Hong Kong has actually thrived by using existing technology, paid on a traded basis maybe. With our IP protection, people are happy to trade their technology, make available the technology here, and putting it into innovation in terms of new business models. And I think it's the new business model that have the real impact. So I think Hong Kong could become a center for innovation. And of course, Hong Kong actually is doing this in conjunction with the mainland, because Hong Kong has no local market. When you need to scale up a new business model, you need a test market. You need a local market initially to do the testing. We're not America. We're not Europe. We're not even Japan, right? There's no local market. Our local market is the mainland. So I think with the proximity to the mainland and access to the mainland through a number of you guys would call free trade agreements, we call something called the CEPA, Close Economic Partnership Agreement. Basically, we have almost complete open access to the mainland. We're one country with two different custom territories under WTO, but we're linked by these trade agreements. So we have access to that. The other thing I should point out is Shenzhen, right across the border, which is really side by side with Hong Kong. It's an 1 hour access to the center, from the center of Hong Kong to the center of Shenzhen, actually is one of the technology centers in China. Some would argue that the innovation in technology is probably even more in Shenzhen than in Beijing, Zhongguancun. It's really Beijing and Shenzhen are the two hubs. So the Hong Kong-Shenzhen axis, which is now developing, I think is going to be a very strong force, not only in the region, but in the world. If you think of that, the global reach of Hong Kong in terms of markets, in terms of financial side, and then the technological reach of Shenzhen, and put it together, it's a very strong measure. And if you analyze that, and that partnership is developing. In fact, this is sort of the second wave of partnership with Shenzhen. We started, as I mentioned earlier, 30 years ago, with developing the global supply chains by outsourcing production to Shenzhen. Now we're actually doing it in the new technology, in the innovation area. The other thing I should mention is Hong Kong continues to be the center for private equity and managing investments. And we started 30 years ago in the venture capital business. The first private equities were managed out of Hong Kong. It continues to be that center for the region. And what we really need to do there is to perhaps go a little deeper into early stage and become the center for angel investing. And I think that is really now where the thrust is for the Hong Kong financial markets. And then providing now a good opportunity for actually, let's say, going public for early stage companies. And those are all things that are very much in the works. So in the innovation area, and especially with China moving in that direction, the whole world, frankly, talking about innovation, I think Hong Kong really has an opportunity. And then the final thing I would say is just the development of Hong Kong's financial markets. The Asian Development Bank has said that in the next 10 years, Asia's infrastructure needs is about $8 trillion US dollars. And I think there is no way this need can be satisfied without private sector participation. And the key to that participation is the development of an Asian bond market, fixed income market, in local currencies. Hong Kong is already the center for the internationalization of renminbi. We have a majority share of the clearing of the renminbi globally. Although there are about 20 centers now, Hong Kong has about 60% of the market. And as the Asian bond market develops, and it will and it must, I think Hong Kong is a very natural place for the development of the Asian bond market. And that, I think, will be the next stage of development for Hong Kong. So yes, I think it is a challenge. It's a challenge for everybody, and Hong Kong is no exception. We're under a lot of pressure. But I think with the mega trends that I'm identifying and Hong Kong's potential roles in the midst of those mega trends, I think there is hope for the future. Thank you.
Dr. Fong, thank you, Dr. Fong, for the very stimulating speech. Can we entertain a few questions?
Yeah, if you have time, I'm happy.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. Maybe we can entertain about 3 questions from the floor. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Fong. I'm Ming, the graduate of Law School 2005. And just one very quick question. And you just talk about the globalization of consumption, globalization of capital, and globalization of manufacture. We've all seen a lot of black swans this year. So from your perspective, do you see any chance that there will be any trend of anti-globalization that would impact our prospect on that basis? Thanks.
Yeah. That obviously is a question that's lurking in everybody's mind. I'll be very open and honest about that. There is a big flow of anti-globalization. And, I think the origins of this, frankly, I'm an economist, so I think I can criticize my own profession. We used to, from the days of Ricardo, we think that if you made the pie bigger, if you have a perfect market, the distribution question takes care of itself. So you actually concentrate on making the pie bigger, and the distribution question takes care of itself. But that absolutely wasn't the case. And what we're really seeing now, almost after the fact, is there is a need to actually work on distribution together with making the pie bigger. And what we're really now seeing is shall we say, a continuous lopsided distribution that is now pervading almost every economy in the world. Some of the phenomenon that's happening in Brexit, some of the phenomenon that's happening in the elections in the US, in my mind, and in Hong Kong is no exception, in many places in Asia is no exception, is really the 99% and the 1% issue. And I think it's an issue that perhaps, people say, well, that was a migraine headache, and you dismiss that year after year, and then all of a sudden it turns out to be a brain tumor. And I think we're kind of waking up to that. So as long as the world wakes up to that and explicitly address the very important issue of the fairer distribution, I think we will then be able to really meet the so-called anti-globalization wave head-on and begin to actually think about accommodating that as we make the move forward in continued globalization. I've always said there is certainly an imbalance right now, but you cannot shrink the pie. You got to keep the pie growing in order to do the reallocation of fairer distribution. Because if the pie shrinks, I tell you, there's no chance you'll do the redistribution. So I think it's the idea of actually continue to grow the pie, but at the same time thinking about the fairer distribution, more equal distribution, inclusive growth of people, economists will say. I think it's going to be the next thing, and the globalization, the continuation of globalization, I think will be actually dependent on our ability to deal with that.
Any more questions from the floor? Wei?
Hi, my name is Wei Gu,
Yes.
and I graduated from the journalism program, graduate school, and I'm part of the Hong Kong preparation commission for this conference. Well, the topic is about Hong Kong, and you have painted a pretty bright future economically for Hong Kong. Just wondering on the political side, now all eyes are on the political future of Hong Kong, and that obviously will have a role on the economic future of Hong Kong as well. So as a businessman, what do you think of the current status of the politics, and where is it going? Thank you.
Well, as I said repeatedly, I'm an economist. And it's very dangerous for an economist to claim to know anything about politics. So I am absolutely in that category. But what I do know is this, that I think Hong Kong is part of China. It's one country, two systems. And I think we actually depend on both. The fact that we're absolutely one part of China, without, frankly, let's be very practical, without access to China as a local market, I don't think many of our initiatives will be able to take hold. But at the same time, Hong Kong is part of China, but we have our own system, and which is the uniqueness of Hong Kong. So I think what is really needed is the balance between the two. And you need both. And I think what we really need to do is to maintain that balance, which I'm sure that all people concerned. But I think there's something else that I would express as individual now in Hong Kong that I feel strongly about is Hong Kong has always been an outward-looking society, an outward-looking economy. That's the only way we have gotten to where we are today. And that's the only way we can thrive in the future. The problem, I think in the recent past is we've become much too internally oriented. Looking at what's kind of inside Hong Kong as opposed to what's happening in the external world. And I think that really has to change. We really got to start thinking outward and what is our role, in the whole world. What is these trends that we're talking about, and I'm sure other speakers will point to other global trends. What is our role? We can't close the door and actually kind of deal with ourselves. And I think that would be very detrimental. So I think my thought would be that Hong Kong really has to really very much turn itself and look outward again. It was very outward. It's become, I'm sorry to say, a lot more inward looking in recent years. I don't think that can continue, and it has to go outward again. And I think if we do, I think there's huge opportunity that would actually allow us to not only thrive economically, grow the pie, but at the same time think about a fairer distribution as we grow the pie. Okay.
We have time for one more question, and I would like to echo Dr. Fong's claim as an economist, because I'm also an economic major. So can we limit the questions of dealing with economics and not politics, okay?
I just won't be able to be much help. Yeah.
Jamie Lin, MBA 06 from Stern. So yes, I think Hong Kong does have its advantages that it has built up for the past 3-4 decades. But right now, when you look at the most valuable companies in the world, so Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon, none of them chose to have a major presence in Hong Kong, but a lot of them actually are choosing to have a big presence in Singapore. So do you feel that it's a threat to the sort of the paradigm that you were describing?
You want the 2-minute version or the 2-hour version of this? I don't want to challenge that statement, but I think one would put a question to that. But let me put it not sort of Hong Kong, Singapore context, but a more macro global context. I do feel that we're in an extraordinary environment today. On the one hand, we're seeing the exponential economy, the new economy, which is fantastic, but frankly, not without its problems, because it's going to actually impact the real economy in a major way in terms of potential impact on jobs and potential impact on government revenues like the tax base as that grows. So, but on a more micro level, I think the world has come from, let's say, I'll use a retail type technology analogy. The world has come from a brick and mortar world, and people think, well, the future must be sort of internet world and the sort of e-commerce world. I don't frankly think that's true. There's a further world beyond the e-commerce world, which is omni-channel. It's really the future stable configuration is not brick and mortar or e-commerce, but a combination. And I think that's going to happen and happen very quickly. But unfortunately, nobody can sit down today and tell you and write down what that business model would be. In fact, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think the only solution for any business is really rapid experimentation, trying out different methods and what. It's going to evolve. The people from the brick and mortar world will migrate up to omni-channel, and the people in the e-commerce world would begin to come to the ground, if you would. And Amazon and others have already shown a propensity to do that. A lot of what's sustaining here, I'm going to have to go back to my experience teaching finance at business school. There is a lot of money in the world. And there's, can I suggest a bubble? there's a lot of now the financial markets, in fact, spilling over and affecting the real economy. Now, at some point, it will return to normality. I can't tell you when. I think, frankly, it depends on when our central bankers stop printing money. You know, the quantitative easing has produced so much, money in the system that you're getting a huge bubble there, which is now, it's the traditional interaction between the financial markets and the product markets. And you're seeing that period. Now, that too shall pass. And we're going to now go to a more rational set of circumstances, and also this move towards omni-channel. Now, in this omni-channel world, I think we need to see who would succeed. I always pose the question, Walmart going to the net or Amazon coming to the ground? They're going to meet somewhere in the middle. Who's going to win out? I don't know. And then if you then think of it that way, then I think Hong Kong has a huge stake and advantage in this respect, because we are, in a sense, very familiar with the brick and mortar world over the last 30 years of our global supply chains. We have a real stake in innovation, many of which are what I mentioned earlier, our ability to actually develop new business models, and then also the proximity to China and the technology there. And putting all that together, I think allows us to play a major role in this new omni-channel world that is coming. Okay.
Thank you.
With
Thank you,
that,
Dr. Fong.
thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fong. I think with that note of this bubble that's been created, I think it sets up the stage very nicely for our next topic, which is investing in these uncertain times. And with that, I'd like to invite the Dean Peter Henry of the Stern School of Business to come up here and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Alfred, and good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I'm particularly pleased to be representing the Stern School this morning at this conference, and it's especially nice to see Andre Q, a member of our Board of Overseers here. So my main job here is to introduce our panel, but permit me just to say a couple of words about the Stern School and its role in this changing world that Victor's just described so aptly. So as Andy mentioned, the NYU was founded in 1831, but the business school at NYU was founded in 1900, except at that point in time it wasn't called the Stern School. It was called the School of Commerce and Accounts. And it was founded, indeed, to be a school for the children of immigrants. And with this initial purpose, the school then went on to become sort of the bedrock of the New York financial industry on Trinity Place and Wall Street, as traders worked by day and came to school by night at what was then, again, the Graduate School of Business, which then moved up to the Square and became the Stern School in 1988. So when I arrived at the Stern School in 2010, the world had gone through a bit of change. There was something called the global financial crisis. And in every conversation I had with the media when I arrived at the Stern School, the question was always, isn't the Stern School going to implode because of the financial crisis? And of course, if you think of today's theme, thriving in a changing world, what we've had to do is to pivot to these changes. And what we've done is to diversify the school in such a way that connects to really three themes that Victor really touched on: globalization, urbanization, and digitization. And I'm not going to speak for very long, I just want to very quickly give you a sense of how we've done this. So in 2010, we actually hired colleague and friend of Victor's named Mike Spence, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, because globalization is such a key part of the picture. And I would say to people, it's not that finance is going away. We need more finance and not less finance in the world, but we need finance to reinvent itself for the 21st century. Victor talked about infrastructure. It turns out there's roughly a $1 trillion a year infrastructure investment gap around the world. So the question is, in this low interest rate, excess savings, low investment, low aggregate demand world, how do we find the way to channel the savings to infrastructure investment in places like the East, Nigeria, Indonesia, big emerging markets that will drive consumption if we can actually put the investment in place to make that happen. So that's the first point. But then urbanization. It turns out, as you look at emerging markets, 2.9 billion people are going to move into cities in the course of the next 25 to 50 years. Virtually all of that net migration from rural areas to urban areas is going to take place in emerging markets. So the next step for us was to recruit somebody who could help us lead on urbanization. So we recruited another professor from Stanford named Paul Romer to lead the urbanization project at Stern. Now that Paul Romer is the chief economist at the World Bank, we feel that we also have a very important voice in this global conversation, as Victor mentioned, around the Bretton Woods institutions, connecting our finance faculty who are doing really important work and have just produced a white paper on the Global Infrastructure Challenge to this bigger picture that's obviously going to require governments as well as the private sector. So that's sort of a macro picture. At a more micro level, of course, digitization. We're very proud we just launched the first fintech specialization in any business school this past summer. We now have 8 courses on fintech that are being jointly taught by our finance faculty and our information systems faculty. So from the macro to the micro, Stern is pivoting to take advantage of these changes in the 21st century to continue to move forward and to thrive in a changing world. So the last point I would make, just connected to Victor's point, as we do these things to envision how we will more efficiently allocate capital across the globe to facilitate infrastructure and higher consumption in the emerging world, we still have to ask this question about distribution. Who gets access, in this case, to the extraordinary education at Stern? And we believe that the best way to address income inequality is to bring more children from poor families to business school. So very consistent with Andy's vision for creating greater affordability at NYU, and I thank him for the emphasis he's put on that. We've gone from 0 to 35 full scholarships in the last 2 years for Stern undergraduates, bringing more and more children from the poorest families, wherever they come from, into business school to teach them how to create value and bring them into this conversation about how finance is pivoting to connect with globalization, urbanization, and digitization to create a more prosperous world. And so with that, I want to ask our panelists to come up. We have an excellent group of panelists today to help us think about investing in a very uncertain world. And so I'm going to call you up one by one. I guess you can kind of come up as I call your names. It's kind of like the introduction to a basketball game or something. So first we have Timothy Mo. Tim Mo is a managing director, co-head of macro research in Asia, and chief Pacific regional equity strategist at Goldman Sachs. Based in Hong Kong, Timothy and his team are consistently rated among the top regional equity strategy groups. Very well. And Tim is also a member of our Stern Board of Overseers. Next, we have Daniel Chan. Daniel serves as managing director at City Investment Management and is responsible for overseeing all of the group's activities in the Asia-Pacific region. In addition to serving as chairman of the CIM Asia Investment Committee, Daniel is also a member of the Global CIM Leadership Committee and the Global Managed Leadership Committee. Next, we have Ronald Chan. Ronald is the founder and chief investment officer at Chartwell Capital Limited. He's the author of 2 books and was recently appointed by the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong Limited to serve as a member of the listing committee panel. And finally, to referee this contest, we have our moderator, Stephen Watson. He's an equity portfolio manager at Capital International Investors with 28 years of investment experience. So my thanks to each of you, all 4 Stern alums, I might add, for leading us through this important conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the panel on Investing in a Certain World.
Thank you, Peter. Just a small correction. I think the referee is actually Ronald, and so.
And I have to say, I'm very, very relieved that that is the case.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. So, the title of today is Investing in Uncertain Times. Perhaps we can ask all the guests here, what are some uncertainties do you see in the world or in Asia? And shall we start with Tim?
Well, thanks very much, Ronald. So there are a host of uncertainties, a number of them that Dr. Fung has mentioned. I think I'll kick things off by noting four things that I think we need to be mindful of as we look into 2017. First, obviously, and very topically, is policy uncertainty, and that's obviously exemplified most immediately by the elections we'll have in the United States on Tuesday, where the policy pronouncements and actions will likely differ quite significantly along a number of axes, depending upon which candidate is inaugurated. Secondly, we have a nexus of uncertainties in terms of monetary policy, and these revolve around what the Fed does, how the US dollar performs, and also how the US bond market trades. Those are all intimately linked. Basically, a more hawkish Fed could lead to a stronger dollar. That in turn is likely to promote a steepening of the yield curve, and all of those would be risks for certainly the equity markets that are my particular area of focus here in Asia. And the third thing is the growth outlook. We're actually moderately constructive about how things look on a near-term cyclical basis. There's some pretty encouraging signs in the recent data in terms of an improvement, for example, in PMI indices around the world and US, for example, third quarter GDP. And we think there may be a mild lift in the global economy looking into 2017. But we're mindful of the fact that in each of the last 5 years, we and the rest of consensus has started generally with an optimistic view on economic growth, and that's been whittled down progressively as the year has continued. So downside risks to growth clearly remain, and this is something which we need to be cognizant of. And that filters down into the corporate earnings outlook as well, which is really what equity markets, is the primary fuel for equity markets that, as I said, I focus on. And here we've had also some signs of a cyclical upturn in earnings, but again, there's some uncertainty about the magnitude and duration of that upturn. And so I guess the final thing I'll say, in addition to the growth factor, is the outlook for a number of strategic headwinds that we've been facing here in Asia. And I think one of them, which Dr. Fung mentioned, and it very much resonates with me, is the impact of technology. It's very much of a two-edged sword. There are lots of benefits from technology, but equally there's tremendous deflationary pressure. Technology tends to work against the distribution that Dr. Fong was mentioning. I'm sure we'll talk about further in our conversation. And so I think we need to understand how this is in fact impacting not just how economies work, how companies fare, but also a number of social spillover effects as well. So I'll stop there and let my other colleagues speak.
Sure. And what are some uncertainties do you see, Daniel?
First of all, I want to thank Andy, Peter, as well as Andre organizing this wonderful event, and it's an honor for me to be here and talking about today's panel. So on top of what Tim has said, I want to elaborate on two things. One is interest rate, and other on the late cycle of where we are in. I mean, if you look at where we are in terms of interest rate, we really have pretty money printing for 5-6 years nonstop. And the consensus is that rates will stay lower for longer. And we at Citi Investment Management still believe in this camp. But however, we could be wrong. And on top of that, central banks, especially European central banks as well as BOJ, can change course because the negative interest rate may not work to revive the economy. And when that change, that will have a huge impact on valuation, not only in equities, but all risk asset class, real estate, bonds. So this is one thing that we really focus on, whether or not this assumption of rates stay lower for longer is correct or not. The second thing is, if you look at the U.S. economy, which is sort of the major developed country that is still growing at a decent pace, it has been a long cycle. If you look at the trough of last recession, which was, I think, July of 2009 to now, we are at our 88th month. And that is the fourth longest economic expansion cycle, going back even 1900s. In 5 months, we will surpass the third longest cycle, expansion cycle we had, which was in the 90s, now 80s. Then you talk about whether or not this economic expansion cycle will continue on and go beyond the second longest cycle, which was in the 60s, where you have a very special event, which are the baby boomer getting married and buying houses, so you have a huge economic boom there. And And of course, the longest cycle we ever had was in the 90s, where you have the internet, Y2K, business investment, and that go on for another to 10 years. So if you look at where we are now to where the longest cycle are, we are really talking about 2.5 years or so. So I personally don't think that this cycle will go beyond the longest cycle the U.S. ever has in the 90s, because it's just a very different environment. From that perspective, then you're talking about the U.S. will go to some recession, whether it's mild or deep recessions, within the next 2.5 years. And if you look at the world outside of U.S., whether it's Europe or Japan, I just don't see that those economies will improve dramatically in the next 1 or 2 or even 3 years. So if you think about that, there's a lot of risk factor into it. Again, that can greatly devalue a lot of the risk asset prices.
What about you, Steve? What concerns you?
Well, first of all, I'll echo Daniel's thanks to the organizers and to all the participants. It's a great event, and I'm really glad to be here. I'll complain, though, a little bit about Dr. Fung, who did us the disservice of saying virtually everything that needed to be said first thing. And so we're all just going to elaborate on all of his points, and I include myself. But I'll try and think of a little different way to say some of what he said. And I would say my biggest concern for the world today is what I would characterize as an inclusion deficit. People are feeling disconnected. People are angry. People are feeling left behind. And it's showing up in the US election. It showed up in the Brexit vote, in the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. We can mention Marine Le Pen in France, Finland First, the five-star movement, AFD in Germany, Duterte in the Philippines, the umbrella movement here. You can go on and on around the world. People are feeling left out, and they're angry. They're protesting. Why did this happen? Well, we live in a growth-starved world, I would say. Economic expectations are down pretty much everywhere. For just one example, Venezuela. When I started at what wasn't yet called Stern, it was a rich country. Now 88% of Venezuelans said they're not getting enough food every day. Much of the world is in crisis. It's about a lack of growth. It's about unfortunate income distribution. It's about the rise of and the power of information technology and how that's changed the world so amazingly over the last few decades. And I think this inclusion deficit is what we really need to focus on and really need to face. Having said that, I'm an optimist. You wouldn't know it, I know. But I really am. There was a very wise man named Herbert Stein who said that unsustainable trends tend not to continue. And I really believe that to be the case. I think the world will get back to growth. I think we have tools to address hunger and poverty. And we will use information technology for the purposes of growth. And we, people here, and many of you in the room will look for investment opportunities therein, try to create value, and we'll see some of these unsustainable trends not continue.
So, Steve, how should we position ourselves as investors? Hold cash, hold gold, or go back to Stern?
Yeah, we may need a refresher course at Stern. I probably do. It's been 31 years since I was there, and I take comfort only in the fact that it's been 32 years since Tim was there.
Thanks for reminding me, Steve.
I think the world needs investing. The world needs sensible investing. The world needs long-term investing. The world needs, and people, let's talk about individuals. Individuals need long-term investment solutions that are tailored to their income, their age, what they need to spend, when they plan to retire, what they'll need when they retire, and they need portfolios constructed presumably with a blend of stocks and bonds and cash, maybe gold, maybe property. But they need to be thinking about those things in a very long-term way. We unfortunately all have a tendency to look for the latest, greatest thing, the hot thing. We all want to be Li Ka-shing. Guess what? We're not. So we need to stop playing a short game, start playing a long game. And I think, frankly, stocks will sit at the center, but not constitute all of that sensible long-term portfolio.
What about you, Daniel? How's the market treating you this year, and how are you positioning yourself for upcoming years or next year?
Sure. Well, I have two investment teams, one Asia fixed income and Asian equities. The fixed income side, we're doing fine. We've been running a very conservative portfolios, intermediate durations. Year to date, up 5%, while volatility is about 2.5%. So our clients pretty happy on that. What we really excel on is equity this year. And part of it is pretty lucky. Last year, this time, we were quite bearish on China, just because we felt that in 2015, to make policy mistakes one after another, whether you think about the Asia market, whether you think about the currency. So we got defensive about this time of last year. And then we were lucky that last year, December, we got a huge inflow into our portfolios. And we sort of kept the cash and did not invest in it. So going into 2016, we pretty much avoid the downturn in the Q1. We got back to the market after we feel that the Chinese government have a better control on the capital outflows. And valuation for a lot of companies is just getting too cheap for us to ignore. So we buy aggressively, and we actually did pretty well. So our equity portfolio is up 15% a year, even though the index is up only 5%. So we are quite happy now. The Howard Marks at Ochi Crabbo said it very well. The biggest risk in the market is when everybody thinks there's no risk. So think about internet in '99 or U.S. real estate in '05, '06. So the fact that we are here talking about uncertainty, to me, is a good thing. But at the same time, again, you have to realize that we are in a very late stage of an expansion cycle. So don't be too aggressive. Think about both upside and downside. And I think, but be courage and move on. And I think, we'll do fine.
Everyone talks about China, and someone thinks it's a hard landing or soft landing. Maybe Tim, what's your outlook?
Okay, so this is the key issue that we get asked and we debate literally globally. I've just come back from running around the world. I've been in Hong Kong about 4 days the last month. I've been in Europe, the US, and various parts of Asia, and I just got back from Beijing 2 days ago. And the issue of what happens to China economically is obviously front and center in most people's minds, and it seems the farther you get away from China, the more bearish people are, so I continually have to put on my virtual armor every time I go to New York and fight off all the China bears who are trying to nibble at me or bite me. But somewhat more seriously speaking, we have for some time consistently held the view that the likelihood of a so-called hard landing, which of course you have to define more specifically because it's kind of a loose term, but we would define it as a very, very sharp slowdown in growth, maybe not an absolute recession, but a slowdown in growth to low single digits and a corresponding very severe pressure in the credit markets and so forth. We think that probability of that is quite low. We have felt that consistently, and we continue to think that way, at least in what we would say would be the near term, which would probably be defined as the next several quarters, and importantly, leading up to next year's 19th Party Congress. So the key issue here, we think, is that you need to understand the economic environment also in terms of the political narrative behind this. And for many of you who I'm sure are aware that next year at this time is a very important event. It's the 19th Party Congress, at which 5 of 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo will be replaced. And that's a key juncture. It's the midpoint of President Xi Jinping's term. And it stands to reason that while the political negotiations are going on as far as who those 5 people will be, that it is in policymakers' interest to ensure that there's a stable economic environment to support those political conversations. So all the feedback that we've had from policy meetings in Beijing and elsewhere, along with our analysis, suggests that the probability of the next few quarters is one of reasonably stable economic growth, that there are the tools, both fiscal and monetary, to ensure that we've got a fairly low level of volatility in terms of macro growth, and that the probability of a sharp credit event is actually quite low in the near term, and that in fact underpins our constructive view on China equities. However, there's also clear evidence that China continues to gear up. The numbers are that China's going to end this year probably with a total debt to GDP figure of 270%. And on the current growth of excess credit relative to GDP, that's likely to increase to somewhere between 330 and 350% of GDP by 2020, which is a very high number in absolute terms, and particularly high if you compare it to per capita income. Therefore, we think that China is effectively sort of kicking the can down the road as far as credit goes, and there, in the intermediate term, is a greater risk of having to so-called grasp the nettle of addressing this issue of credit growth, if nothing else, to at least stabilize the level of credit growth, even if there's not a deleveraging, at least a stabilization in the level of leverage, and that is going to be growth suppressive. So therefore, our view on China is no hard landing, certainly not in the next several quarters, and probably not until late next year, but probably late 2017 and 2018, there's likely to be more pressure, which will probably manifest not in a sort of a sharp crisis, but probably more in a persistent deceleration of growth.
Steve, do you see the same thing, same feel, or you have more to add?
Oh, I always have more to add.
Steve's not shy.
Right, I think it was Mo Udall who said, everything's been said, but everything hasn't been said by everybody, so now I'll talk. You know, I think I would just maybe offer some what ifs about China. You know, and I guess the big one is what if the Chinese economy starts to appear to us more like just an economy, and not this thing that is either growing to the sky or about to go down the sinkhole, as people in New York or especially Greenwich, Connecticut, where the hedge funds live, would say. I was back 4 or 5 years ago. I was kind of cautious relative to a lot of my colleagues on China, because I said, you know, it's really it's kind of hooked on exports and infrastructure investment, and the economy feels very lopsided. And people said, my own son accused me of being a China bear. That really hurt. And then, as everybody else seemed, or many other observers, particularly in the U.S., got cautious on China, said, well, they've got a lot of levers they can pull still. You know, they do have a consumption and service economy growing on the order of 10% today. It's true that their industrial economy is moribund, but the state-owned enterprises need reforming still. World trade is pretty poor. Maybe that gets a little better. So you know, what if, back to my what ifs, what if China kind of just muddles through? It's true, as Tim says, that debt in China is approaching 270% of GDP, but global debt to GDP is 290%. And the globe is characterized by a lower growth rate than China's got today. So I think they muddle through. What if, last point, we start thinking of China more as a sort of normal investing, a normal place to invest, where securities get priced on the value and fortunes of the companies we're looking at. I was looking at some share prices today. You know, Alibaba's up 25% this year, but Tencent growing 40%. Sinopec, the oil company, is up 20%, but poor Huaneng Power, the electricity company, is down 32%. Anhui Conch Cement is up 4%. Angang Steel is up 30%. Why? Because their fortunes are different. Their managements are different. Their business approaches are different. Their future growth rates are different. And people are starting to be better at at pricing securities based on sort of old-fashioned fundamentals. So China, what if? China just kind of figures things out, muddles through, and what if we look for and find value in investing there?
What about Daniel? How are you positioning your Chinese investments?
I mean, the whole discussion about hard landing and soft landing, the investment team and I constantly have this debate because it's a very important subject, especially at the beginning of the year where, the Western hedge funds, where the Soros of the world talk about this, the Lehman moment of China, the Minsky moment of China. And the way, if you look at the bad side of China, it's all true, right? Whether you're talking about the debt problem, whether you're talking about the oversupply in a lot of the industrial commodities, it's all true. At the same time, we also see the good side of China, where a lot of companies, Steve mentioned, still growing at 30–40%. And a lot of industry and sectors still growing at double-digit levels. So you really have to balance between the good and bad side of China. And on top of that, if you look at the China economy today, it's a $10 trillion economy. Okay, the money supply, or M2, is 23 trillion, and they are still printing money at 11 or 12% level. Used to be 15%. So the Chinese government is dumping 3 trillion into a 10 trillion economy every year. That solves a lot of problems, and that solves a lot of issues. Now, of course, the flip side, you have to watch over the inflation, whether it will get too high. And of course, the second one is the political stability. So as long as these two risks is sort of minimized, this money printing of 3 trillion in 10 trillion economy will solve a lot of issues. And that's why, in February, we turned very bullish. And we just think that we're on a soft landing side instead of a hard landing.
A couple of days ago, there was a story on Bloomberg mentioning about Hong Kong. If you trade in between 20,000 to 24,000, you beat the market. And now that we are in Hong Kong, close to China, what do you all see about the Hong Kong economy, and where do you see the market going? Tim, you want to?
So I think I'll pick up where Dr. Fung left off and echo Steve's point that we're just shadowing what has already been said. But I guess a couple of things. I think Hong Kong needs to find some new engines of growth. The economy has clearly slowed from the robust days. I remember the heady days of 1987, if we can even think back to those dim, distant Paleolithic times, when the economy here grew 14%, when Deng Xiaoping announced the opening up of southern China and basically all of Hong Kong's manufacturing sector moved over the border. There was a boom. I mean, can you just imagine GDP growing 14%? It was a really heady time. Now we're sort of lumbering along at 1 and 2%, and I think that we need to find new engines of growth. Many of the ones that Dr. Fung talked about make sense. You just can't say, gee, I want to be a manufacturing powerhouse when you're an economy of 7 million people. That's not going to happen. It's obviously got to be more service-orientated, and it's got to be higher added value and intellectual value, and it's got to play on the strengths that Hong Kong has. But I think we need to find more avenues of growth. Slightly on the bearish side, I would say that I appreciate, and I think it's wonderful how rapidly Shenzhen has grown. But I think there is some danger that Shenzhen is outstripping Hong Kong. We visited a number of companies there recently. It is a hotbed of technological development. There's a real exciting vibe that's taking place there. Many of the companies that are likely to become accessible to foreign investors through the imminent opening of the Shenzhen-Hong Kong Connect are really genuine growth companies with interesting business models and none of the excess leverage and overcapacity issues that are hampering the industrial sector. So there's a role model that Shenzhen is providing, but it's also providing some significant competition to Hong Kong, and I think Hong Kong needs to rise to that challenge.
As a local, Daniel, what's your take?
Yeah, unfortunately, even I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Hong Kong. Right now, we don't have much investment in Hong Kong companies. But I think it's a little bit of changing. The Hong Kong Shenzhen Connect or Shanghai Connect. It is a good step forward. And what is also significant is in September, the Chinese insurance regulators allow Chinese insurance company to invest in the X shares through this Shanghai Connect and Shenzhen Connect. And that will be huge, and that will help the X share market a lot. The insurance company today probably have only 2-3% foreign investment outside of China. And on equities, probably in mid-teens type of allocations. The maximum they can have in overseas investment is 30%, as 15% with 30% in equity investment. So that will bring sort of a huge flows of investment in the medium term. So I'm pretty bullish on that part of things. But in terms of the Hong Kong economy, I mean, early on, Victor talked about the mismatch of the retail shops that we have, which was geared towards the very, very high end. But at the same time, the tourists we receive today is no longer that high-end tourists. So I think there will be some adjustment there. I think a lot of Chinese companies want to go overseas, and the first step they will do is open an office in Hong Kong, and that will benefit the commercial real estate sectors. And because of the money printing of 3 trillion and 10 trillion economies, the Chinese developer is buying a lot of land and developing Hong Kong to the point that I think is very, very excessive. Early on this week, they just had Hong Kong had a land sale in the old airport. The price for that piece of land was 13,500 per square foot. Now, 2 years ago, similar location, similar size, was 6,500, so basically double. That wasn't the crazy part. 2-3 months ago, another developer just finished a finished residential building in the same area, selling for 13,000 to 14,000 per square foot. It's a finished building, right? We're not talking about empty land. So for this new Chinese developer, buy a piece of land at 13,500, build a sort of mid-end high-rise or condo, probably cost him 4,000 to 5,000 a foot. So if you do the math, the real estate prices in Hong Kong needs to go up another 30% to 40% in order for this developer to break even on this project. This to me is just kind of crazy, but it's a side effect of the money printing going on in China and the rest of the world.
What about you, Steve? So do you share the same concern as Daniel? And is your firm, selling Hong Kong or seeing a bubble in Hong Kong in property or in the market in general?
Well, if we decide to sell Hong Kong, I won't announce it here first. So, I guess what I would say is, I was first a visitor here 35 years ago, and one thing that I've been impressed with ever since is this extraordinary capacity that Hong Kong has for self-doubt. There's always something really bad that's going to happen to Hong Kong, and we're always really, really nervous about it. I moved here to live 16 years ago, and a lot of people, I moved from London, a lot of people said, well, why would you go to Hong Kong? Just go straight to Shanghai, because that's obviously going to be Asia's financial capital. And I said, well, you know what? 10 years before that, I moved to London. Everybody said, why don't you move to Frankfurt on the same basic thesis? And guess what? Frankfurt wouldn't have been that great a choice, and I would argue Shanghai wouldn't have been that great a choice for me. Hong Kong is vibrant, dynamic, it changes, it reacts. And I kind of imagine that carries on if the tradition of light touch government and regulation can continue, if personal freedom remains abundant, if entrepreneurs are allowed to be entrepreneurial. Yeah, Hong Kong's got my vote.
Shall we open up the floor for questions? Anyone?
First, I'd like to thank the panelists for a very insightful speech. Maybe I'll shift gear a little bit, because obviously I think the panelists have been talking about like Asian investment. And Andrew mentioned next Tuesday when he lands in JFK, depends on the outcome. his play may turn around. So I'd like to turn a question to you guys. So now the U.S. election, the second, the big swan that we're anticipating this year is the U.S. election. So it depends on outcome whether Hillary Clinton wins. Some people in the financial world forecast is going to be 5% to 10% increase. And if Donald Trump wins, the U.S. equity market will collapse 10, 15%. So I'd like to, on behalf of all the alumni and guests here, and maybe they have some investment in the U.S., can you, each of the panelists, comment on what's the outcome? What do you think is going to happen? Depends on, who wins the election. Thank you.
Hey, Danny, you want a show of hand here if we think that Donald Trump wins, the market will go down?
Oh, yeah, I think that, yeah, well.
Should we take a poll?
Maybe we should take a poll, So whoever thinks Hillary Clinton will win, please show of hand. Okay.
Donald Trump?
Donald Trump?
Oh.
Looks like, to me, based on my big data computation, looks like a 60-40 split, roughly, approximation. So it looks like a 60% probability if the NYU alumni to be the forecast of the U.S. election is accurate. But I think it's pretty consistent with the recent U.S. poll. So,
what do you all think?
I'll launch maybe, and I will throw in. I attended a dinner with a former U.S. governor this week, and he says Trump's going to win. Trump's got the momentum, and according to some of this former governor's clever contacts, Trump may even have the electoral votes. We'll see. That's not a forecast for me. And will the market go down, up? In either case, I don't have a clue. I never know what the market's going to do. It's possible. We shall see. I guess I take some comfort in the fact that in the U.S. system, the ability of a president or of any specific individual to do real damage to the system is pretty limited. Thank heavens for checks and balances. Here again, I guess I'm the muddle through panelist. I think we'll muddle through. Both parties, after the fact, need to really rethink their selection process. And maybe they can dwell on my thoughts about the inclusion deficit, because there's a lot more inclusion is needed in the process in the States.
Actually, the investment team and I had just the same discussion yesterday. So obviously, our base case is that Hillary is going to win. But of course, after the Brexit experience, we have to think about the downside. So, our view is that, of course, if Trump wins, the market will take a hit. But also, more importantly, it's not just the presidential election, but also at the House and Senate as well. It's quite likely that the Senate will be taken over by the Democrat. And if that's the case, even Trump became president, there's check and balances, as Steve talked about. It's not so bad. But also, if you look back at the Brexit experience, after the initial drops of 10% in 2 weeks, or a little bit more in some markets, it was very clear that central banks around the world will no longer raise rates, especially the U.S. So I think the U.S. election will change the directions of Federal Reserve that at current stance will probably raise rates in December. But if Trump wins and the market drop, I think that will be gone away. And then with the continual money printing, rates lower for longer, and I think asset price will gradually come back up. So we didn't raise any cash ahead of the elections, and hope for the best next Wednesday.
So we've been thinking along the election, maybe we could think of things along three levels. The top level is that historically there's always been an increase in so-called political uncertainty going into an election. There are some objective metrics that you can look at as a way of measuring political uncertainty, and if you do sort of an average of all the elections since 1988, that tends to increase into the election, and then obviously that's manifested by a corresponding increase in uncertainty in financial markets, which gets prices, increased volatility, and risk. That script is certainly playing out this year, given the recent revelations in the last week and the narrowing of the polls, and the market's already has already begun to price some of that. So I suspect that if Mr. Trump does win, that the downside will not be as great as it would have been, say, 2 weeks ago, because some of that has already been priced. That's number one. Number two, it helps to think about or reflect or just remind oneself of what the candidates agree on, which is precious little, but there are two aspects which are clear. Number one is a propensity towards greater fiscal stimulus, particularly on the infrastructure side. And so the magnitude may vary, but we're likely to have a greater fiscal pulse in the US and greater focus on infrastructure spending, which in fact is one of the themes we like very much. And it echoes, again, what Dr. Fung was saying. One of our key thematic ideas in Asia, not connected to the US election directly, but maybe helped by the spillover effect from a sentiment standpoint, is this theme of investment in infrastructure. The other aspect the candidates unfortunately seem to agree on is being tougher on trade. Obviously, Mr. Trump is much more so than Hillary Clinton is, and it remains to be seen how strong those views are held once you transition from being a candidate to being actually in the seat. But it's likely that from an Asian perspective that we will not see as great emphasis on trade inclusion, and that's, I think, something which is a real fundamental potential negative spillover from the outlook from the U.S. election. And then the third area is where the candidates differ, and that comes down into much more of a sector-specific area, and there's three particular sectors that are of note that we would highlight. One is on energy, second is in the financial markets, and third is in healthcare. And there are quite different policies that the candidates have espoused in each of those directions. So our sense here is that we have kind of a spike of uncertainty into the election. Markets will respond to that afterward. After whatever happens, I think the fundamentals will again reassert themselves, market will find a level, and then we have to see what specific policies are being espoused by each of the potential candidates. And very much to Steve's point, the checks and balances in the U.S. system are there. They're well designed, and they do keep extreme policies from tending to manifest. So I think that the muddle-through scenario is also a pretty good one to espouse.
If Mr. Trump wins, I may buy some cement company, given the wall he wants to build.
Any questions? Please.
Yes, I'm Lorraine. I'm Sterney. I just like to see there has been a court order about what's happening on the Brexit right now. I just wonder, will Brexit continue to go forward, or would there be kind of a reversal through the debating among the MPs later on? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
I think the court case is important as an illustration of what a messy process Brexit will be. I think Brexit happens. I think it would be tremendously difficult and even painful for the UK to reverse what's already underway. But we don't really know what Brexit means. So there will be a Brexit, that's my forecast. But what shape will it take? I think it's going to be a couple of years before we really know. And with luck, an accommodative Brexit will be negotiated. But again, it's going to take a while, and it's going to be messy and volatile along the way.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. It's a very complex situations. And also, not only you need to focus on UK and in EU, but there are many elections going on, will go on next year. I mean, Italy, there will be a vote in early December on that. So the whole Brexit, how it ends, what that means, I think nobody knows at this point in time.
Yeah, I would just pick up on that thread, and this kind of cycles neatly back to the original question about uncertainty. In fact, the whole title of this conversation here, and there's a much abused quotation of Donald Rumsfeld in terms of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and I think that one of the issues and the challenges with something like Brexit is that We know now that it's going to take place, but the exact form and exactly what the rules will be basically are unknowable right now. There's a number of different hypotheses, but you don't really have a clear sense as to what the path will be. The problem with that is that it makes planning for life post-Brexit very, very difficult, even for financial institutions such as mine. If you know what the future will bring, it may not be palatable, but you can plan for it and adapt and adjust. But if you don't know what the rules are going to be, then you're kind of frozen, and that uncertainty is something which is detrimental to economic activity. So I think that the sooner we have some clarification as far as what the roadmap will be, I think that will be good for investors and for the real economy.
Now, at the same time, if you are a large European company today, you can issue a 5-year bonds, and the coupon is 0. And people will just bid up because there's negative interest rate. So think about that from a business perspective. If you and I can borrow money at 0 for 5 years, even the world is a little messy, even the political situation is a little messy, I think we can come up with some business that can make a couple percent. All right? So you have to look at the other side of things. And also, if you think about the negative interest rate in Europe, the dividend yield in European companies on average is 3.5%. I mean, that's a huge spread compared to you put in money and then the bank take your money because you put money in bank, they take you. So you have to look at both the messy side as well as the benefits or the advantage of being in the messy situations.
Maybe just to leave a question with you, something to ponder. Will we look back on the Brexit vote in 20 years and say, wow, that was sort of the first volley, the first major volley in the deglobalization war? Will Brexit seem like a one-off, or will it seem like an early event in the unwinding of some of the globalization trends that, frankly, we've all benefited from? Time will tell.
Any more questions? Danny.
Yeah, I think Daniel mentioned a point that it's a very interesting point that you mentioned that European corporates now borrowing at 0%, right? I think also recall financial news recently. I think Oxford recently raised a bond in England. I think very low borrowing cost, 2% roughly. I think this is something that Mr. Hamilton, also Dean Harry should ponder, that maybe NYU or Stern, whichever, that should take advantage of the low borrowing costs in Europe or whatever. Because I'm pretty sure the way of cost inflation, cost of education, is much, much higher than 1%. So that's something to leave it for the school to consider. But I just like to follow on that question, because all the panel have mentioned, Dr. Fong have painted a picture of lower rates for longer. So basically, the quantitative easing has caused yield compression. So we're now in a world of almost no return. I mean, Germany have been borrowing of negative interest rate. I don't know how they can do that, but it's kind of strange, at least against what I learned at Stern. But that's what you do. So I would like to ask on behalf of all the alumni here. So based on recent financial news, I think I remember it was GIC and also Blackstone, two of the institutional investors in the world that invest in all asset classes around the world. I think that only these days, the only two asset classes remaining that's above 6% are private equity and emerging equity. So I would like to ask the panelists, given the circumstance today, what the return expectation for all of us, the individual investors, for the next 2 years should be, and perhaps what's the best alternative in the global asset class and regions, obviously including cash, if cannot buy gold, maybe cash. So thank you.
Well, I mean, I'll kick it off, take the bait. Our sense is that we are, as you just said, Danny, in a low return world. We think equities have a good place in that world. Right now, we're market weight on equities in our global asset allocation portfolio, and we're looking at sort of mid-single digit returns. That's the kind of That's the kind of expectation that we've got. We think you lose money on government bonds. We think you have a negative return because the yield is next to nothing. I mean, U.S. 10-years are 170 whatever last night, and we think you get capital loss as rates rise. And obviously, at the longer end of the curve, you get a lot more price compression than you do the coupon. So we think you lose money in government bonds. Credit we still like, although spreads have narrowed, so we're not quite as keen on that. And so kind of tactically, we're overweight cash and credit, we're market weight on commodities and on equities, and we're underweight government bonds. And we think that, I think the real juice is going to be if you can go underneath the surface of the asset classes and look within. One of the things which we are continually pounding on is the alpha opportunities, particularly in Asia. The disparity in terms of market returns, sector returns, country sector, theme returns is huge, even though the overall return for the MXAPJ index has been about 6-7% this year. You've had a 30% spread between the best and worst performing market and between the best and worst performing sector. So this is the national anthem for active investment as opposed to the passive trend which is taking place.
Yeah, I'll just throw in, for example, the S&P 500 over the last 100 years has given a return of something just shy of 10%. But over the last 100 years, if you invested in the S&P 500 at a valuation where it is today, you made about 4%. That's maybe not such a bad way to set expectations for investing specifically in the S&P 500. But then the S&P 500 is significantly more expensive than the rest of the world's stock markets when you put them all together. So I think Tim said it, equities are the place for probably most of what people should be investing in, individual people. Yes, here's to the active investor. I mentioned there are stocks in China that have done very well this year, despite the gloom of a year ago. A number of the stocks I mentioned are up 25 to 35%. So there's always opportunity. Maybe I'll end with mentioning that basket case of a year ago, Brazil. Who would have ever put money there? The currency had collapsed. The government was collapsing. The commodities they live on had collapsed. Guess what? Petrobras is up 130% since then. Vale, the mining company, is up more than 100%. Bovespa, the stock exchange, is up on the order of 90% since then. So guess what? There will be opportunity.
You have anything to add?
Yeah, I think for fixed income investor, you just need to accept the fact that 3% is a good number. I think for equity investor now, for professional investors, I think there's still a lot of opportunity for us to find companies that can double their earnings or cash flows within the next 3 to 5 years, and therefore you're thinking about 15 to 25%. And if we can buy it at a reasonable price, I think we can still make a double digit on those stocks. However, the opportunity is getting less and less. But at the same time, as we are living in this uncertain, volatile world, it also creates a lot of opportunities, right? I mean, if the A-share didn't go to 10 times or 8 times PE in February and we go in aggressively at that time, there's no way we could make the 15% return year to date. So, so we need to be nimble, we need to be flexible, and buy and hold probably is not a strategy that will give you the high return these days, I think.
So on that note, if any of you need any investment advice or invest in their funds, you can walk up later on and greet them and ask them how are their charges. Maybe they'll do it for free as a Sternie. So thank you so much.
Round of applause.
Thanks very much, Ronald. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, speakers. I think Dean Hendry can be proud that Stern has trained some good alumni. And with that note, we will have lunch at the roof garden. There is an elevator at the back, and there's also stairs you can take. There will be staffers helping you, showing you the way.
We'll make an announcement.
Okay.